There is a kind of silence that offers no comfort. It doesn't arrive gently when the dust settles or when the curtains are drawn at the close of a long day. It comes without warning, like a door slamming shut inside a house you believe to be empty. And when it comes, it leaves behind something that no one can quite put into words. That is the kind of silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14, 1837. By morning, 43 people had vanished. Not a single body was ever found. There was no trace of a struggle anywhere on the property. No official explanation was ever entered into any record. And the men who were hired to find answers stopped asking questions faster than anyone could reasonably explain. What remained was a plantation house that was still warm from lit candles. A supper table set for 9 people. And a silence so complete, so deliberate, that the men who first walked through those grounds the next morning later told a neighbor he had never in his life been afraid of a place the way he was afraid of Harrow Hall. He couldn't say why. That uncertainty bothered him more than anything else, and it should bother you too. Before we go any further into the story of Harrow Hall, if you've never heard what happened on that October night in the Carolina back country, you're about to understand why this story stayed buried for nearly 40 years, and why the people who tried to uncover it were quietly and carefully discouraged from doing so. Make sure you subscribe to the Fear Sermon so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below telling us where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's go back to 1837. To really understand what happened at Harrow Hall, you first have to understand what Harrow Hall actually was. Not just as a piece of property or a name on a deed. It was a living, breathing world of its own, running by its own laws and its own rhythms. It had unspoken rules that everyone who lived there understood without ever being told. The plantation sat in the Carolina back country, about 18 miles east of a trading post called Barracks Crossing. That place no longer shows up on any modern map, but back in the 1820s, it appeared on surveying charts as a small cluster of buildings along a creek that eventually fed into the PD River. The land itself was flat and heavy, the kind of ground that seemed to soak up light instead of reflecting it. The tree line pressed in close from every direction, and the sky above the fields always felt somehow smaller than it should have. By autumn, the cotton that had filled those acres through the long punishing summer had already been picked, ginned, and baled. All that remained were the brittle stalks, row after row of them, brown and dry, rattling in the October wind and making a sound that one visitor described as something caught between a whisper and a shaking bone. Harrow Hall itself, the main house, was a 2-story timber frame building put up in the early 1810s by a man named Cornelius Tanner. He had come south from Virginia with enough money to buy 500 acres and the ambition to turn them into something lasting. The house wasn't grand by the standards of the big coastal plantations. There were no tall white columns, no sweeping oak-lined drive leading to the front door. But it was solid and carefully built, the kind of place a man like Cornelius Tanner would put up. Every beam was squared off. Every board fit tight. The kitchen stood in a separate building, along with the smokehouse and the cotton gin. There was a well near the yard, a barn big enough for a dozen animals, and behind the main house, set back about 200 yards, were the rows of slave cabins that held the men, women, and children whose labor made every part of Harrow Hall possible. By 1837, Cornelius Tanner had been dead for 6 years. The plantation passed to his only surviving son, Elias Tanner, who was 34 at the time of our story. He had recently married a woman named Eleanor Vance, the daughter of a merchant family from Columbia, and he was deeply, almost obsessively concerned with keeping up the appearance of prosperity that his father had worked so hard to build. Elias Tanner wasn't a cruel man in the obvious ways cruelty announces itself. He didn't fly into rages. He wasn't known as someone who enjoyed exercising power just for the sake of it. He was, in the words of a neighboring landowner who later gave testimony about what happened in October 1837, a man who simply did what the situation required of him and called it order. That difference between outright malice and the quiet, everyday violence of just keeping a system running is something historians have wrestled with ever since. But the people living in those cabins behind the main house didn't have the privilege of making that distinction. For them, what Elias Tanner was like as a person mattered far less than the world he controlled. Eleanor Tanner was a more complicated figure than her husband. She came to Harrow Hall as a bride at 22, bringing with her a piano, 3 crates of household goods, and a sensibility shaped by a gentle upbringing that had kept her at a comfortable distance from the realities of where her family's wealth actually came from. She wasn't ignorant. She was well-read by the standards of her time and place. Letters found among her papers decades later suggest she had a private moral struggle going on inside her, one she never let show on the surface. What she did with that struggle, or what she chose not to do, would later become one of the most troubling questions surrounding that October night. The third member of the Tanner household, at least among those living inside the main house, was Garrett, Elias's younger brother. He stayed in 2 rooms at the back of the second floor and had shown up at Harrow Hall in the spring of 1836 under circumstances that were never fully explained. Garrett Tanner was 28 in 1837. He had spent several years in Charleston doing something no one was willing to say plainly, though the word death showed up in more than one account of his past. It seemed he came to Harrow Hall not out of brotherly affection but out of necessity. He and Elias kept things civil and distant. They ate at the same table. They did not, as far as anyone could tell, trust each other. And then there was Ward Driscoll. If any one figure in this story needs a careful introduction, it's him. He arrived at Harrow Hall in March of 1837, 7 months before that October night would turn the plantation into something people whispered about across 2 counties. He was hired as overseer after the previous one, a man named Clifton Haywood, left abruptly under circumstances that had already started their own quiet rumors. Haywood had managed the enslaved workforce for 3 years, and his departure, which happened at night with his belongings packed and his horse saddled before anyone in the main house was awake, wasn't something Elias Tanner felt any need to explain. Overseers came and went. The work went on. But Haywood's leaving wasn't just a resignation. The people in the cabins knew things about why Clifton Haywood slipped away in the dark, things Elias Tanner didn't. And the arrival of Ward Driscoll changed the atmosphere at Harrow Hall in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to miss. Driscoll was tall and lean, the kind of lean that comes from years of physical work. His face was pale and weathered, and it seemed to have settled into a permanent expression of assessment, like he was always measuring the distance between where he stood and where he needed to be. He came with a single letter of recommendation from a plantation near the North Carolina border, signed by a landowner named Gideon Falk, who called Driscoll a man of decisive character and firm principles, well suited to managing a large property. What Falk didn't mention, what only came out later through patient digging in archives, was that Driscoll had left Falk's employment under circumstances that looked a lot like how Clifton Haywood left Harrow Hall, at night, without warning. Leaving a silence behind that no one wanted to disturb. By the summer of 1837, Harrow Hall had settled into a new rhythm under Driscoll's watch. A rhythm that everyone inside those gates could feel, even if no letter, no record, no document ever captured it. And underneath that rhythm, in the spaces between what was visible and what was written down, something was being planned. Something patient. Something careful. Something that had been years, maybe longer, in the making. History has a way of recording the names of people in the main house. It's less reliable when it comes to the people who built it, kept it running, fed it, and made everything inside it possible. But those names did exist. They show up in fragments, in estate inventories, in church records, in the accounts of abolitionists who traveled through the South collecting testimony in the years that followed. Putting those pieces together is the only honest way to tell this story. Reuben was 41 in the autumn of 1837. He had been at Harrow Hall since he was 7, brought there by Cornelius Tanner from a property in Virginia. Over those 34 years, he had built up a kind of knowledge that only comes from long, close attention to a place and its people. He knew the land. He knew which part of the low field flooded in a wet spring. He knew which boards in the cotton gin creaked in a way that meant they needed replacing. He knew the names of every animal in the barn and could tell from the sound of a mule's step whether it was favoring a leg. In the eyes of just about everyone who dealt with Harrow Hall in those years, he was indispensable. And he had spent a good part of his life understanding exactly what that meant, and exactly what it didn't. Reuben was tall, spare, and slow in his movements. His face had learned through long practice to show only what he chose to show. Around the people in the main house, he spoke little. Around his own people, in the cabins, in the quiet moments after the work ended and before it started again, he was different. He was the kind of man others turned toward without really knowing why, like a compass needle finds north. Not because he was loud or demanded attention, but because he was steady, and that steadiness made other people feel steadier. His wife, Delia, was 36. She worked in the main house, mostly in the kitchen, but also in whatever way Eleonora Tanner needed her. That meant Delia moved through the main house with a freedom of physical access that was unusual. And that, as we'll see, mattered a great deal in the weeks before October 14th. Delia was sharp in the way of someone who had to understand people quickly and completely because for her, understanding people was survival. She read rooms the way a sailor reads weather, watching for small signals others might miss. A shift in the angle of someone's shoulder. The way a sentence ended just a little too fast. The direction a man's eyes moved when he heard something he didn't believe. She had been reading Ward Driscoll since the week he arrived, and what she read scared her in a way the previous overseer, for all his faults, never had. It wasn't what Driscoll did that scared her. It was the kind of attention he paid to things other men in his position never bothered with. He watched. He remembered. He kept a mental catalogue. Within his first 2 months at Harrow Hall, he had learned more about the life inside the cabins, the relationships, the small networks of trust and favor among the enslaved community, than Clifton Haywood had learned in 3 years. And he did it without seeming to try. That was what made Delia's stomach turn cold when she thought about it at night. Driscoll wasn't careless. He was the opposite of careless. A man like that, in the position he held, with the authority he carried, was something far more dangerous than someone who was simply brutal. The third figure at the center of this story was August. He was 19, the youngest of the three in terms of the role he would play, but not in terms of understanding. August was born at Harrow Hall, the son of a man named Henry who died when August was 12, and a woman named Nora who was sold to a property in Georgia when August was 15. In the 2 years since his mother was taken away, he had become quieter and harder, the way a stone gets harder when the water around it dries up and the air gets to it. He wasn't bitter in any way that showed on the outside. He worked with a focus that Driscoll had noted approvingly in his first weeks, which meant August had managed the rare and difficult thing of being noticed as capable without being noticed as dangerous. But August had something that neither Reuben's steadiness nor Delia's perceptiveness could give him. He could read. Not well, not fluently, but enough. He had learned the way enslaved people who learned anything in the antebellum South had to learn. In fragments. Covertly. At enormous personal risk. From sources that were never the same twice. A page from a discarded almanac. The label on a crate. The back of a broadside nailed to a post at Barracks Crossing. Over years of this, he had put together something that worked. Not literacy in any formal sense, but the ability to decode enough of a written document to understand what it basically said. And in the summer of 1837, a document came to Harrow Hall that August very much needed to understand. The letter arrived in July of 1837, addressed to Elias Tanner. It was carried from Barracks Crossing by a boy who made the postal run 3 times a week on a swaybacked mare. It was a routine delivery among several others. A bill of lading. A copy of a Columbia newspaper. A note from Eleonora's mother. Elias opened it at the dining room table on a Tuesday morning in the second week of July while Delia cleared the breakfast things around him. She didn't read over his shoulder. She didn't need to. She watched his face. Elias Tanner wasn't a man given to visible emotion. But as he read that letter, a single page folded once and sealed with plain wax, something moved behind his eyes that Delia had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was closer to calculation. That quick internal shift of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had under control and realizing he didn't. He folded the letter, slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, and left the dining room without finishing his coffee. Delia finished clearing the table. She went to the kitchen. She set down the plates she was carrying with a care that was almost too careful. The kind of slow, deliberate movement of someone managing something inside themselves they can't afford to let out. Then she went to find Reuben. She didn't tell him what she had seen. Not yet. She wasn't certain enough. But she filed it away in that precise, orderly archive she kept behind the calm surface of her daily life. And she waited. 3 days later, she found the letter. It wasn't hidden in any clever way. Elias had put it in the top drawer of the writing desk in his study, a room Delia went into twice a week to dust. Elias, confident the letter was just another administrative paper in a drawer full of them, hadn't thought to lock it. She didn't take it. She couldn't explain a missing letter, and she was too careful for that kind of exposure. Instead, she memorized what she could of the first paragraph. That was enough. She closed the drawer, left the room, and waited for the right moment to find August. The letter was from a land agent in Colombia named Percival Oates. Its content, as best as August could later piece together from what Delia had memorized of the key passage, was this. Elias Tanner had at some point in the previous years taken on a significant debt, secured against the enslaved people at Harrow Hall. The debt was overdue. The agent was writing to tell Tanner that if the balance wasn't paid before the end of the year, the creditor, a man whose name appeared in the letter but Delia hadn't been able to commit to memory, would move to enforce the security. That meant, in plain language, a forced sale. Not of the land. Not of the house, the cotton gin, the barn, or the livestock. Of the people. All of them, or enough of them to cover what was owed. By the agent's estimate, that could mean as many as 30 individuals. In a community of 43, 30 wasn't a partial loss. It was an ending. August sat with this information for a long time before he brought it to Reuben. He sat with it the way you sit with something that has changed the shape of your world, something you can't unknow. Then, on a Sunday evening in late July, when the light came low and orange across the stubble fields and the air smelled of dust and cooling earth, the smell August had known his whole life, he went to find the older man. Reuben listened without interrupting. He sat on the step of his cabin, his hands clasped between his knees, his face doing that thing it did, that absolute deliberate stillness. He listened until August had said everything there was to say. Then he was quiet for a long time. Then he said in a voice too low to carry, "How long do we have?" August told him until the end of December at the latest. Reuben nodded. He looked out across the fields at the fading light. At the familiar landscape of a place where he had spent 34 years of his life. He looked at it with the specific attention of a man considering the possibility that he was seeing it for the last time, and deciding, very quietly, what to do about it. "Then we have until October," he said. "Maybe November. Not longer." August didn't ask why those months specifically. He understood. October was when the cotton was in, when the year's work was finished, when the ground was dry and the nights were long enough to matter. He understood because he had spent his whole life paying attention to exactly those things. What he didn't yet understand was that Reuben had been thinking about this possibility for much longer than July of 1837. Not this specific letter. Not this specific creditor. But the fundamental instability of their situation, and what it might eventually require. Much, much longer. There were things Reuben carried inside him that he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. Things that had to do not just with Harrow Hall, but with the wider world. The geography of it. The routes through it. The names of people in places he had never been but knew existed. To explain how Reuben came to know what he knew, you have to go back several years. You have to go back to a summer evening in 1833 when a man named Tobias, a free black carpenter from a town called Lancaster about 50 miles north, came to repair the roof of the Harrow Hall barn and stayed for 3 days. Tobias wasn't just a carpenter. That is, carpentry was what he did for money, and he was good at it. But it wasn't the only work he did during those 3 days at Harrow Hall. On the evening of his second day, while Elias Tanner was away at Barracks Crossing on business, Tobias and Reuben sat together in the barn until very late. And what passed between them was something Reuben held inside him ever since, with the care of a man who understands that certain kinds of knowledge are both precious and dangerous. Tobias told Reuben about routes. Specific routes with specific landmarks. A creek crossing here. A particular ridge line there. The location of a safe house connected to a Quaker family 17 miles north, and a second contact point beyond that. Tobias told him about timing. Why autumn was better than spring. Why new moon nights were better than full ones. Why a Sunday departure, when the gap between disappearance and discovery was longest, was worth planning for. Tobias laid it all out in the specific, practical language of a man who had helped others travel this route before, and who expected to help others again. Reuben listened to every word. He asked questions, careful, specific questions, the kind that told Tobias the man across from him wasn't overwhelmed, wasn't dreaming, but was processing information with the disciplined focus of someone who understood that this knowledge might one day be the difference between everything and nothing. When Tobias left the next morning, roof repaired, payment received, not another word exchanged about what had been discussed, Reuben spent 3 days doing nothing except working and thinking. Then he began to plan. Slowly, carefully, over the following years, without ever letting what he was planning become visible in anything he said or did. He talked to people. Not all at once, not in any way that could be called a meeting. One at a time, in the most natural settings. In the field. In the barn. On Sunday evenings. He had conversations that would have sounded to any observer like nothing more than ordinary exchanges between people who had lived alongside each other for years. But they weren't ordinary exchanges. They were assessments. He was learning who among the 42 other people at Harrow Hall would be willing to go. Who was strong enough, not just physically, but in that harder, deeper sense. Who had ties elsewhere that would hold them back. Who had children young enough to carry and old enough to walk. He was calculating weight, distance, risk, and will. By July of 1837, when August brought him Delia's news about the letter from Percival Oates, Reuben had been at this work for 4 years. He hadn't told even Delia the full extent of it. Not because he didn't trust her, but because in a world where discovery could come from any direction at any time, knowing less was sometimes the safest form of protection. But now the timeline had changed. What had been a long, careful preparation with an uncertain future destination had become something with a deadline. And the first thing that changed about the plan, once Reuben let himself accept the urgency, was that he had to start telling people things he hadn't told them yet. That process of expanding the circle, of bringing more people into the knowledge of what was being planned, began in August of 1837 and continued with extraordinary care through September and into the first week of October. It was, by any measure, one of the most disciplined acts of collective planning the Carolina back country had ever seen. And because it was done by people who had been made legally invisible by the society around them, almost no record of it was ever made. Almost no record. But not quite none. In the second week of September 1837, Elias Tanner gave permission for the Harrow Hall enslaved community to attend a Methodist camp meeting at a place called Peavy Grove, about 4 miles from the plantation. This wasn't unusual. Camp meetings, those big outdoor religious gatherings that swept through the South from time to time, drawing both white and black attendees in numbers that could reach the hundreds, had become a regular part of backcountry life by the 1830s. Many plantation owners, Elias Tanner among them, let their enslaved workers attend. The reasons were mixed and not always kind-hearted. Some believed the Methodist focus on discipline and order served their interests. Others simply knew that the social release of a camp meeting took some of the pressure off a captive community that otherwise had nowhere to go. What plantation owners who allowed camp meeting attendance rarely counted on was the extent to which those gatherings served a completely different purpose for the people who went. A purpose that had nothing to do with Methodist theology and everything to do with the chance to be, for a few days, among a large crowd of people from many different properties, with a freedom of movement and conversation that ordinary plantation life never allowed. The Harrow Hall group, 28 people in total, the rest being too young, too old, or too recently arrived to make the trip, got to Peavy Grove on a Thursday afternoon and left on Sunday morning. During those 3 days, in the spaces between the preaching and the singing and the shared meals, conversations took place that Elias Tanner never knew about and that no circuit rider ever wrote down. Reuben spoke to a man named Cyrus, who had come from a plantation near Society Hill, and who had traveled further along the route Tobias had described than Reuben had ever been. Cyrus confirmed certain details, the creek crossing, the ridge line, and updated others, because routes changed over the years. People moved. Houses that had been safe became unsafe. New contacts appeared where old ones had gone. Delia spoke to a woman named Harriet, whom she hadn't seen in 3 years. Her presence at the camp meeting was for Delia both a relief and a confirmation. Harriet had information about the land north of Lancaster, gathered over the course of 2 previous journeys that hadn't succeeded. 2 attempts to leave, both interrupted before they got more than a dozen miles from their starting point. She shared what she had learned from those failures with the specific generosity of someone who understands that her hard-won knowledge might let someone else succeed where she hadn't. Delia listened with tears in her eyes that she let herself shed, because a religious revival was one of the few places where tears didn't need an explanation. And August, quiet, watchful August, who had spent the 3 days of the camp meeting moving through the crowd with the unobtrusive attention of someone just looking for familiar faces, made contact with a white man. His name, as far as August ever let on, was Edmund. He was connected to the Quaker network Tobias had told Reuben about 4 years earlier. His presence at a Methodist camp meeting wasn't accidental. He was there specifically to make contact with exactly the kind of person August turned out to be. Someone planning to move. Someone who needed to know there were others along the route expecting them. Edmund and August spoke for 11 minutes, standing near the food tables in the open air of the campgrounds. Their conversation would have looked to any observer like just another casual exchange among dozens happening around them. By the time those 11 minutes were up, August knew 3 things he hadn't known before. A specific departure window. A first landmark. And a phrase, 3 words in English, that would identify him and the people with him to the first contact point north of Harrow Hall. When the Harrow Hall group returned on Sunday morning, they looked exactly the same as when they had left. They picked up their tools and their tasks and their careful, practiced expressions of routine compliance. But something had shifted in the air between them. Something that anyone paying very close attention might have noticed, the way a small but real change in atmospheric pressure can be felt before the weather turns. Ward Driscoll, as it turned out, paid very close attention. He noticed it first in the evenings. Something different in the quality of the silence coming from the cabins. Not louder. Not more agitated. But different. The way a held breath is different from relaxed breathing, even when neither makes a sound. He couldn't have put it into words, which was exactly what made him most suspicious. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts were telling him something had changed. After the camp meeting, in the first week of October, Driscoll started what he called, in his own private thinking, a closer observation. He changed up his evening rounds. He varied the timing, sometimes before supper, sometimes after dark, sometimes in the early morning hours. Never at the same time twice in the same week, so no pattern could be predicted. He watched who spoke to whom, and when, and for how long. He noticed who seemed tired in the mornings, suggesting late nights. He paid special attention to Reuben, whose stillness had always struck him as slightly unreadable in a way that bothered him. And to August, whom he had earlier marked as a valuable worker, and now began to see through a different lens. He didn't report his suspicions to Elias Tanner. Not yet. Partly that was professional. A good overseer didn't bring a plantation owner problems without also bringing solutions. And Driscoll didn't yet have anything concrete enough to count as a problem in the owner's terms. Partly it was something else, something harder to name. A kind of private satisfaction in the detection itself. In the feeling of being the only one in the main house who understood what was really going on. He wanted to let it develop a little more before he shut it down. That decision to wait, to watch, to let things go on for a few more days before stepping in, was the decision that would define everything that followed. Whether Driscoll ever understood that is something we'll never know. He wasn't the kind of man to leave records of his private thinking. What he left instead was an absence. His name appears in the Harrow Hall accounts up through October 13th. And then nothing. Not a single verifiable document with his name on it after the night of the 14th. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the night of October 14th, you first have to understand the 7 days that led up to it. The days when everything that had been quietly, patiently, invisibly built over years was compressed into its final, irreversible shape. What do you think was happening in those cabins on those long October nights, while Ward Driscoll changed up his rounds, and Elias Tanner went over his accounts, and Eleanora Tanner played her piano in the parlor with the windows shut against the autumn chill? Drop your theory in the comments below. We want to know what you think was coming. And if this story is giving you the feeling that something terrible and something necessary are about to arrive at exactly the same moment, you're right. Stay with us. The 7 days before October 14th were, by every outside account available, unremarkable. The cotton had been ginned. The bales were stacked in the gin house waiting to be taken to market. The fields were empty of their summer load and stretched flat and brown in the autumn light. The weather had turned cool but not cold. Nights dropped into the 50s with a clear sky and a waning moon that by the 14th would be 3 days past new. That meant the night of October 14th would be almost moonless. Anyone who had spent time on a farm in the Carolina backcountry in the 1830s would know what that meant. A moonless October night with clear skies and no rain was about as close to perfect traveling weather as the season offered. Enough light from the stars to find your way in open country. Cool enough to move fast without wearing out. Far enough past the growing season that the roads were quiet. No wagons hauling cotton to market at odd hours. No extra traffic to notice strangers moving through the dark. Reuben had known from the beginning that timing was a matter of the calendar as much as anything else. He had learned from Tobias, and Cyrus had confirmed it at the camp meeting, that the nights of a new moon were when experienced travelers moved. He had set his departure window for the 3rd week of October, and the waning moon of October 14th was the start of that window. It was, in other words, not an accident. It had been chosen. During those 7 days, the preparation that had been building for months was brought to its final stage. And the way this was done, the methods, the logistics, the extraordinary discipline of 43 people keeping up the appearance of complete normality while carrying out a coordinated departure, that is one of the most remarkable stories of collective action in the antebellum South. Even though it would stay mostly unknown for nearly 40 years. Supplies had been gathered slowly over weeks, in amounts so small and so ordinary that no single act of gathering would stand out. Dried corn. Salt pork. A length of rope. Extra cloth. Each item got through the normal flow of daily work. The small overflow from a harvest here. A little set aside from a shared meal there. And hidden in spots Reuben had picked out over the months of his planning. A hollow in a specific tree 200 yards behind the farthest cabin. A loose board under the floor of the old smokehouse that hadn't been used regularly since spring. Nothing that couldn't be innocently explained if found. Nothing so large in quantity that it suggested, on its own, anything beyond ordinary life. There were also arrangements of a different kind. Arrangements involving the people themselves and the question of who would go and who would stay. This is the part of the story that is least documented and hardest to piece together. And it's also the part that needs the most careful treatment, because it involves choices made under extreme pressure. And those choices weren't simple or the same for everyone. Not everyone at Harrow Hall was part of Reuben's plan. Not because they were left out of trust, but because Reuben and Delia and August had, over the months of preparation, developed a clear sense of who could physically make the journey. And who, for reasons of age or health or the particular weight of their circumstances, could not or should not be asked to. There was a woman named Bess who was 63 and had a heart that sometimes acted up in the night, leaving her gasping and gripping the frame of her cot until it passed. There was a man called Old Silas who was somewhere past 70 and had told Reuben directly, without any visible sorrow, that his traveling days were behind him. There were 2 infants. There was a child of 4 named Clara, too old to be carried all night and too young to keep up on her own. These conversations, the ones Reuben had with the people who would stay, in the quiet spaces of those 7 days, were by any measure the hardest part. They were also, in the structure of this story, the part that most clearly shows what was really being done here. Not an impulsive flight. Not a panicked response to immediate danger. But a considered, organized act by people who had thought through every part of what they were attempting and made deliberate choices about it under conditions where deliberate choice was itself a kind of revolutionary act. The people who would stay knew what was happening. Most of them had known for weeks. Their choice to remain, some made willingly, some made under the particular grief of understanding that a body can be willing but a 63-year-old heart might not, was not a betrayal. And it wasn't treated as one. Reuben had been clear about this in the conversations he had with each of them individually. The people who stayed would know nothing. They would be able to say truthfully that nothing unusual had happened. They would be able to face the interrogation that was sure to come, and it was sure to come, without the burden of knowledge that would put them at risk. This too was a form of planning. A form of care carried out under the most unlikely circumstances. By the evening of October 13th, the 43 people of Harrow Hall had, without a single visible break in their daily routines, sorted themselves into two groups. Those who would go and those who would stay. The supplies were in place. The route was memorized. Not written. Never written. Carried entirely in the minds of the people who would need it. The departure signal had been agreed on. The contact phrase August got from Edmund at the camp meeting had been passed to 3 other people. That way, if August got separated from the group in the first miles, the knowledge wouldn't be lost. And Ward Driscoll, who had been watching very closely for almost 3 weeks, had found nothing. Which was itself a signal. The supper table at Harrow Hall was set for 9 on the evening of October 14, 1837. This detail, the set table, would become one of the most talked about things Hiram Cook found when he arrived the next morning. It suggested normalcy. It suggested the people who lived in that house had sat down to a prepared meal and then gotten up and left. Or that the meal had been prepared and the people who prepared it had never sat down. The difference mattered, and it was never resolved. What is known is this. Delia made the evening meal in the kitchen house, like she did every evening. The table in the dining room was laid. Plates, cutlery, glasses. A covered dish of food still warm when Cook arrived. The next day. And Delia did not serve it. At some point, between the making of that meal and the hour when Elias Tanner would have expected to sit down to it, Delia walked out of the kitchen house, crossed the yard, and did not come back. That walk across the yard, a distance of maybe 40 feet, a trip she had made hundreds of times, was the moment when everything Reuben had planned for 4 years became irreversible. The question of exactly what happened in the main house that evening, what Elias and Eleonora and Garrett knew or suspected or did, is one the later investigation never really answered. Partly because the people who could have answered were either not talking or not believed. And partly because the official record of that investigation was, as we'll see, subject to pressures that had nothing to do with finding the truth. What we know is that by the time the October dark had fully settled over the Harrow Hall property, sometime between 8 and 9 in the evening, by the most reliable of the later accounts, there was no sound coming from the cabins. Not the ordinary sounds of an evening. Not voices. Not movement. Not the sounds of children. Nothing. Just the wind off the fields and the dry rattle of the cotton stalks and the silence. And the silence was total. To understand how 43 people leave a plantation in a single night without being detected until morning, you have to let go of the idea that disappearance requires hiding. It doesn't always. Sometimes the most effective form of disappearance is movement. Moving at the right speed in the right direction at the right time, with enough of a head start that detection, when it comes, arrives too late to matter. The departure wasn't one moment. It was a sequence, carried out with the kind of precision you wouldn't expect from people who had never run a military campaign. Until you remember that the whole lives of those people had been a kind of continuous campaign. A daily navigation of threat and constraint that demanded exactly the kind of tactical thinking and escape of this complexity required. The first to leave were the people with children. They went in the time after supper was done and before the evening rounds. Moving through the tree line at the back of the property and heading northeast along the creek that Reuben had walked 100 times in the ordinary course of farm work. They carried what they could carry. And they moved quietly, not because they were told to, but because the people in that group had understood, longer than any of them could say, that quiet was the language of survival. The second group left 30 minutes later. They went a different way. Due north through the Sims property that bordered Harrow Hall to the northwest, along a route Reuben had picked because the Sims property ran unfenced on its northern edge for nearly 2 miles. That meant crossing it left no gate, no fence line, no obstacle that cost time. They would meet up with the first group at the creek crossing Cyrus had confirmed at the camp meeting. The third group, the last to go, was Reuben himself, August, 2 other men, and a woman named Phoebe. She had insisted, even with an ankle that wasn't fully healed, on being in the last group instead of the first. Because she was one of the people who knew the whole route. If something happened, if an alarm was raised, if the first 2 groups ran into trouble, she would know what to do. Reuben was the last person to leave the Harrow Hall property. He stood for a moment at the edge of the tree line and looked back at the place where he had spent 34 years. He didn't look at it with sentiment. He looked at it with the flat, clear attention of a man finishing an assessment. Making sure of something. Confirming something. And then he turned and walked into the trees. The candles in the main house were still burning. The supper table was set. The kitchen fire, banked but not out, cast a low orange glow through the kitchen house window. Everything looked exactly the way it would have looked if the people who lived there had just stepped out for a minute and were about to come back. They were not about to come back. Hiram Cook was a farmer who lived 3 miles from Harrow Hall. He had an agreement with Elias Tanner to deliver a load of split-rail fence posts on the morning of October 15th. By his own account, given later to the barracks crossing magistrate, he arrived around 7 in the morning with a wagon full of posts and a hired man named James riding alongside on horseback. The first thing Cook noticed was the silence. He wasn't a man given to fanciful thoughts. He said that explicitly in the account the magistrate recorded, which still exists today in a county archive, though only in part. He was a plain man, he said, not given to fancy, and he wasn't in the habit of feeling things about places. But he told the magistrate that as he drove his wagon up the lane toward Harrow Hall and the silence pressed in around him, he felt something he couldn't name. Not exactly fear. Something next to it. The feeling, he said, of a place holding its breath. The main house door was unlocked. He knocked. No answer. Called out. Nothing. He opened the door. The supper table was set. The food had sat there long enough to be cold. The candles in the parlor had burned down to stubs and gone out, leaving pools of hardened wax on the candlesticks. Eleanora Tanner's piano was open, the lid up, a piece of sheet music on the stand, like the player had stepped away in the middle of practicing. Upstairs, the beds were in different stages of being made or unmade. Not the careful order of people who had left with intention. Just the ordinary mess of a day interrupted. There was no sign of struggle. Not in the main house. Not in the yard. The barn animals were there and had been fed at some point recently. The water troughs weren't empty. The hay was fresh enough. The cotton gin was locked with its usual padlock. The smokehouse was secured. And the cabins were empty. Not abandoned in the way of a rushed departure. Nothing was knocked over. Nothing was broken. But empty in the way of rooms whose occupants have taken with them everything that mattered and left behind everything that didn't. Pots on their hooks. Tools in their corners. Clothing that was worn out or too big or too small hanging on nails. The ordinary collection of things that can't make a journey and were left behind on purpose, not by accident. Cook walked the length of the cabin row twice before he spoke. Then he turned to James, who had followed him without a word, and said something James remembered exactly 40 years later, when an interviewer finally found him in his 80s living in a town in Ohio. What Cook said was, "They're gone. All of them." And then after a pause, "God Almighty." And then they went to find the sheriff. The sheriff of the county where Harrow Hall was located was a man named Porter Baines. He was 51, had been in the job for 11 years, and was, by the accounts of people who worked with him, a capable and unsentimental man. He approached his duties with the particular efficiency of someone who had seen enough of human behavior to stop being surprised by most of it. He arrived at Harrow Hall with 2 deputies around 11 in the morning on October 15th. He stayed for 4 hours. He talked to Hiram Cook, the hired man James, and Elias Tanner, who had been found at a neighbor's property where he had apparently gone the afternoon before. That timing would become one of several details investigators noted as unusual, though none of them ever followed up on it completely. Eleanora Tanner was in the main house when Baines arrived. She had been alone in the house since the previous evening, or so she said. She gave her account calmly, in the careful language of a woman who had spent years managing how she came across. She told Baines she had heard nothing unusual in the night. She had gone to bed at her normal time. She had woken up to find the house the way he was seeing it now. Baines wrote down her account. He noted in the report he filed with the county court 3 days later that Mrs. Tanner seemed composed and cooperative. He did not write down what she didn't tell him. What she didn't tell him, what would only come out decades later from a source none of the original investigators had thought to check, is something we'll come back to. What Baines did in those 4 hours at Harrow Hall was establish the basic facts. 43 enslaved people were missing. No violence was obvious at the scene. The escape, because that's what he called it in his report, without any visible surprise or commentary, seemed to have happened during the night of October 14th. He started what the laws required. Notices to neighboring county sheriffs. A description of the missing people to be sent out through the usual channels. A request for any information about a large group moving through the region on the night of the 14th. Those requests, over the next 2 weeks, produced exactly nothing. Not one report of a sighting. Not one witness who had seen a large group moving through the back country on the night of October 14th or the days after. Not one informant. And there were informants in every county of the Carolina back country, men who made part of their income reporting on the movements of runaway individuals or groups, if they had anything useful to say. This was itself extraordinary. A group of 43 people moving through populated country in the middle of October should have been seen by someone. The lack of any sighting reports wasn't proof of anything. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But it was, even to a man as unsentimental as Porter Baines, worth noting. He noted it in a single line at the end of his report. No reliable information has been received regarding the current location of the said individuals. And then, as far as the official record was concerned, the investigation ended. Just when we thought the investigation was going somewhere, just when it seemed like someone in authority was going to ask the questions that needed asking, the silence closed in again. Not the silence of a plantation at night. The silence of men with authority choosing not to look too hard. If this story is already making your skin crawl, share it with someone who loves unsolved history and hit that like button so more people can hear what actually happened here. Because the real story, the story of why nobody found anything and what someone was hiding and what Elias Tanner knew, is only just beginning. The official record of the Harrow Hall investigation, such as it was, runs to about 12 pages. Baines's initial report. 3 pages of witness statements. A document recording the formal notice to nearby counties. And a short summary filed 6 weeks later noting that the investigation had turned up nothing useful and was being put on hold pending new information. That last document, the one putting the inquiry on hold, was filed on November 29, 1837 and signed by Porter Baines and also signed by the county judge, a man named Harlan Voss. It is the last official paper in the Harrow Hall file for that year. It is also, on close reading, a deeply unusual document. The first unusual thing about it is the timing. 6 weeks from the disappearance of 43 people to the formal suspension of an investigation was, by the standards of the time, remarkably fast. Especially for something on this scale. The disappearance of 4 or 5 people from a single plantation wasn't rare in the Carolina back country, and those investigations often went on for months. The disappearance of 43 was unheard of in living memory. Closing the inquiry after 6 weeks was such a break from normal procedure that at least one legal scholar who looked at the file in the 1890s called it an administrative anomaly with no clear explanation. The second unusual thing is a gap in the file. Between the first witness statements and Baines's November summary, there should be, based on how these investigations normally worked, a series of documents in between. Follow-up reports from neighboring counties. Records of any individuals picked up and questioned in connection with the case. Notes from any additional witness interviews. Those documents are not in the file. They are not mentioned in the November summary as having been received and found unhelpful. They just aren't there. The file jumps from the early October papers straight to the November closure, with nothing in between. Now, this could have any number of ordinary explanations. Papers get lost. Misfiled. Damaged. Accidentally destroyed. Archives in the antebellum South weren't kept with the care of a modern filing system. The absence of those intermediate papers doesn't by itself prove anything. But it's the third unusual thing about the file that is hardest to explain away. In the November summary, Baines wrote the following sentence. It doesn't seem to connect to anything else in the document and has no clear reference in the earlier text. The matter having been reviewed with appropriate parties and the circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry, it is the judgment of this office that the foregoing case be closed. The circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry. That sentence is not standard legal language. It is not a phrase that appears in any other document in the county records from that period. It is a sentence written by a specific man to say a specific thing. That someone, somewhere, had made a decision about what was and wasn't worth pursuing in the matter of Harrow Hall. Who those appropriate parties were, Porter Baines never said. He died in 1851, leaving no memoir, no private papers, no correspondence anyone has found that mentions the Harrow Hall case. The county judge, Harlan Voss, died in 1858. His papers went to his son, who burned most of them after a fire damaged his home in 1862. A fire the local paper called accidental and no one at the time had any reason to question. The trail, in other words, went cold in the way trails go cold when the people who might have followed them chose not to. There is a detail in the Harrow Hall story that the official record mentions and then almost immediately drops. And it's the detail that, once noticed, is the hardest to stop thinking about. When Porter Baines arrived on the morning of October 15th, Elias Tanner was not at Harrow Hall. He was at the neighboring property of a man named Abner Pruitt, a farmer who owned a modest piece of land about a mile and a half to the south. Tanner had gone to Pruitt's place on the afternoon of October 14th, hours before the departure of his entire enslaved workforce, and stayed overnight. He got back to Harrow Hall on the morning of the 15th, just before noon, about an hour after Baines had started his investigation. The official reason for this absence, as written in Baines's report, was that Tanner had gone to talk about a fence boundary dispute that had been going on between the two properties. Pruitt confirmed this in his own statement. Tanner came in the afternoon. They talked about the fence issue over supper. Tanner stayed the night because it got late. This was believable. Fence arguments were a constant in back-country life. Overnight visits between neighboring landowners weren't unusual. Baines apparently accepted it without pushing further. But there are several things about this account that, when set next to the other pieces of the story, create a discomfort the official record doesn't address. The first is the timing. Elias Tanner left Harrow Hall on the afternoon of October 14th, the day of the departure, hours before it happened. He was not there when his workforce walked out. Whether this was coincidence or design, his absence meant he wasn't in a position to respond in real time to anything that might have reached him from the property. The second is Abner Pruitt himself. In the years after October 1837, Pruitt kept running his farm with no visible change to his situation. He wasn't wealthy, not politically connected, not a figure of any special importance in the county. He appeared, in short, to be exactly what the official record said he was. A neighbor. But his name shows up in one other place the official record doesn't mention. In 1834, Abner Pruitt briefly hired as a seasonal hand for the spring planting a man named Tobias. A free black carpenter from Lancaster. The same Tobias who had come to fix the Harrow Hall barn roof in the summer of 1833 and spent 3 days there talking with Reuben. Whether this connection means anything, whether Pruitt's relationship with Tobias had any bearing on the events of October 14th, is something we can't determine from the records that survive. It might be coincidence. In a world this small, in a county this lightly populated, connections between people were often unremarkable. People knew each other. People hired the same workers across different seasons and properties. But in a story that has already produced this many coincidences, one more presses against the edges of comfort. And then there is the matter of Eleanora Tanner. Eleanora Tanner was alone in the main house on the night of October 14, 1837. Her husband was at Abner Pruitt's farm. Her brother-in-law, Garrett, was, by her account and the account in Baines's report, at Barracks Crossing. He had gone there 2 days earlier and hadn't come back yet. That meant on the night when 43 people walked out of Harrow Hall, the only person in the main house was Eleanora. She had set the supper table. She had put out the food. She had at some point in the evening closed the piano lid, but not all the way, leaving the sheet music in place, the lid resting at an angle against the stand. She had gone to bed. And she had heard nothing. That's what she told Porter Baines. That's what the official record contains. She heard nothing. She saw nothing. She had no warning and no prior knowledge. The question of whether this was true occupied the mind of one person for a very long time. A woman named Adeline Spratt. She was the granddaughter of Eleanora Tanner's personal seamstress, a free woman of color from Columbia named Grace, who had made occasional visits to Harrow Hall in the years before 1837. And who, according to family history passed down through Adeline's line, kept up a correspondence with Eleanora Tanner for several years after the events of that October night. Adeline Spratt was 73 in 1875 when she gave the testimony that is in many ways the most important document in the whole Harrow Hall story. She gave it to a journalist named Oliver Hatch, who was working for a paper in Columbia and had gotten interested in the story through a chance encounter with the partial Baines report in the county archive. Hatch had spent 2 years looking for anyone who might have direct knowledge of the events of 1837. And when he found Adeline Spratt, he found something he hadn't expected. She had letters. The correspondence between Eleanora Tanner and Grace, Adeline Spratt's grandmother, had continued from 1838 until 1851 when Grace died. 11 letters survived, kept in a box Grace had held onto and that had passed to her daughter and then to Adeline. They were not, for the most part, letters that spoke directly about the events of October 14. Eleanora Tanner was too careful for that. By 1838, she had been shaped enough by the experience of living in a world where letters could be read by unintended eyes that she rarely said plainly what she meant. But she said it in other ways. The most important letter is dated March 12, 1842. It was written 4.5 years after the night of October 14. On the surface, it's about something completely unrelated to Harrow Hall. A piece of blue fabric Eleanora was trying to get from a merchant in Columbia. But tucked into the letter, with the particular indirection of a woman writing carefully, is this passage. I have thought often of what you said when last we met about the nature of actions that cannot be undone and whether it is better to carry them in silence or to speak them to someone who will understand. I have decided, as I believe I was always going to decide, though it took me time to arrive at it, that silence is sometimes its own kind of truth. There are things I know about that November, things I have never spoken of to or to anyone who might bring them back into the light. I do not repent of what I chose not to do, nor of what I chose to do, which may amount to the same thing in the end. I am well. I trust you are also well. The fabric, when you find it, should be a deep blue, and not the pale color they sold me last year, which was unsuitable. I do not repent of what I chose not to do. She said November, not October. The month when she had given her testimony to Baines. Not the night itself. But the sentence before it makes the meaning clear enough. What did Eleanora Tanner choose not to do? The most direct interpretation, the one Oliver Hatch arrived at in 1875 and that historians who have since worked with this letter have generally agreed on, is this. Eleanora Tanner, alone in the main house on the night of October 14, knew what was happening. Or suspected it strongly enough that the difference between knowing and suspecting was mostly academic. She heard the silence fall over the cabins. A silence she had lived with the sounds of her whole adult life at Harrow Hall and would have recognized the sudden, complete change of. She understood, or sensed, what that silence meant. And she chose not to raise an alarm. She could have. She had access to the property's bell. That big iron bell used to signal emergencies and call workers, mounted on a post at the edge of the yard. She could have gone to the neighboring property for help. It was dark. It was late. But it wasn't impossible. She could have done something. She chose not to. Whether this was a principled act, a woman who had spent years in private moral struggle finally making a choice that matched what she had always known to be right. Or whether it was something more complicated, more mixed, more afraid, is something we can't settle from a letter about blue fabric. What we can say is that the silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th was kept in the main house by a woman who heard it and understood it and let it stand. That was its own kind of courage. In a world where courage took more forms than the official record was usually willing to admit, there is one more person whose fate needs accounting. The one whose disappearance the official record found most awkward to explain. Ward Driscoll. When Porter Baines got to Harrow Hall on the morning of October 15th and did his investigation, Ward Driscoll was not there. His quarters, a room attached to the back of the barn, separate from both the main house and the cabins, had his belongings. His tools of the job were in their usual places. His horse was in the barn. But Ward Driscoll was not. Baines noted this in his report and listed it as something that needed explaining. He put Driscoll among the people whose whereabouts were unknown, not alongside the enslaved community, but in a separate category. In the neutral administrative language of someone who has found something he doesn't quite know what to do with. The investigation produced no answer. Driscoll was never found. No account of him afterward, a new position on another property, a return to North Carolina, any verifiable life activity after October 14, 1837, was ever established. He just vanished from the record. The way a man can vanish from a record when no one with the authority to look into his disappearance has a strong reason to. The question of what happened to Ward Driscoll is the question the Harrow Hall story has never been able to fully answer. There are several possibilities, and each one says something different about what happened on that October night. The first possibility is that Driscoll found out about the departure while it was happening. That his watchful, varied rounds finally brought him to the right place at the right time. And that he tried to stop it and was stopped himself. The lack of violence at the site makes this harder to hold as a simple explanation, but it doesn't rule it out completely. A man stopped in the dark by people who had everything to lose, in a situation where the alternative to silence was catastrophe. The details of an encounter like that wouldn't necessarily leave visible evidence in the cabins or the yard. The second possibility is that Driscoll found out about the departure and, for reasons that were entirely his own, chose not to get involved. A man who had himself left 2 previous jobs under cover of night, whose own history was marked by sudden unexplained departures, might have looked at what was happening around him on the night of October 14th and made a private calculation that had nothing to do with loyalty to Elias Tanner. Maybe he saw an opportunity. Maybe he recognized in what he was seeing something his experience in similar situations told him could not be stopped and chose to remove himself from the situation rather than be tied to a failure of this size. Men in his line of work were paid to prevent exactly this. A failure this big, in a world where reputation was everything, might have ended his professional life. The third possibility is the one no official document ever explored, but that once raised, can't be put back down. That Ward Driscoll wasn't caught off guard at all. That he knew in advance what was being planned. That his weeks of careful watching had not failed to pick up on the preparation, but that what he had detected, and what he had sat with in the quiet of his barn room, had moved something in him. Something his letter of recommendation from Gideon Falk and his career enforcing the system he served would not have predicted. That Driscoll, the man hired to watch the people at Harrow Hall, had watched them and had chosen in the end to look the other way. We cannot know. We have only the absence. A horse in a barn. Belongings on a shelf. A man who was there and then was not. And that absence, like so many things about Harrow Hall, refuses to settle into certainty. What happened to the 43 people who walked out of Harrow Hall on the night of October 14, 1837? The full answer to that question would take years to piece together. And putting it together was the life's work of Oliver Hatch, the Columbia journalist who found Adeline Spratt in 1875 and spent the last 2 decades of his life following threads through archives, personal testimonies, church records, and the scattered documentary trail the Underground Railroad and its participants left behind. Deliberately scattered in the years before and during the Civil War. What Hatch had established by the time he died in 1892 was this. 27 of the 43 people who left Harrow Hall in October 1837 reached free territory. The route they took, confirmed by the accounts of contact keepers along the way, several of whom gave testimony to Hatch or left records he was able to access, went from the South Carolina back country north through North Carolina, then into Virginia's western counties and onward through the mountains, avoiding the coastal routes where surveillance was heaviest. The trip took 11 days, by Hatch's best estimate. 11 days on foot with children, carrying what they could carry, moving at night, and resting in the hidden spaces of a network of people who were risking everything to help them. Of the 27 who made it to free territory, Hatch was able to trace the later lives of 17. Some settled in Pennsylvania. Several went further north. 2 eventually crossed into Canada. One woman, Hatch identified her only by her first name, Phoebe, was by 1875 living in Ohio and was the matriarch of a family of 11. The grandmother of children who had never known the word plantation except as history. She was, Hatch wrote, a woman of such self-possession and directness that an hour in her company completely changed my sense of what the people of Harrow Hall had done. He never found Reuben. He found evidence that Reuben had made it to the first contact point, the Quaker safe house north of Lancaster. But after that, the trail went quiet in a way that suggested to Hatch, not death, but intentional obscurity. A man who had spent 4 years planning the most careful escape in the county's history would not, upon reaching free territory, advertise his location. Reuben, wherever he ended up, had spent a lifetime learning to be invisible when invisibility served him. August, Hatch believed, had settled somewhere around Philadelphia by 1840. He found a reference in a Quaker community record to a young man of the right age, the right physical description, who had arrived in the city in the winter of 1838, and who had later been helped to find work by a member of the Quaker meeting. The entry in the record gave only his first name. It noted that he could read and was eager to learn more. Of the 16 people who did not reach free territory, those who had stayed at Harrow Hall and the 16 among the departing 43 who were separated from the main group or turned back in the first days, the records are harder and the stories are less kind. Those who stayed were questioned, not gently, in the weeks after October 14th. The official record does not preserve the content of those questionings in any detail. What it preserves is a note in the county records that no information of use was obtained. Which was true, because the people who stayed had been protected from that knowledge with exactly this moment in mind. Delia was among those who reached free territory. We know this because of a single document. A letter written in a hand that scholars who later examined it described as unpracticed but careful. Dated January 4, 1838. Addressed to a woman in Columbia whose identity is not clear. The letter is short. It says, among other things, that the writer has arrived safely at a place she does not name. That she is well. That she is grateful for what cannot be named. And that she hopes the person reading the letter knows that what was done with full knowledge and full will. The letter is signed with a single initial. D. Oliver Hatch believed it was Delia. The handwriting, unpracticed, as if the writer had only recently learned, fit someone who had been taught to write in her adult years under great pressure. The date, 3 months after October 14th, fit the timeline. And the phrasing, what was done with full knowledge and full will, had the specific quality of someone who understood she was writing for a record, even if the record was only a single page in a single letter that might never be found. Full knowledge and full will. Those 5 words are as close as we get in the documentary record of Harrow Hall to a direct statement of what happened on October 14, 1837. And why? Elias Tanner spent the 3 months after October 14th in a state his neighbors, the ones who saw him during that time, described as agitated, distracted, and in the words of one observer who knew him well, a man who has looked into a room he didn't expect to see and cannot decide whether to describe what was in it. He did not go to court. This, given the legal framework of the time, is remarkable. Enslaved people were property under South Carolina law, and the law had specific ways to pursue their return, including legal action against anyone who had helped them escape. That a plantation owner who had just lost 43 people, an asset of huge monetary value by the brutal math of the slave economy, did not pursue these legal options with any real energy, is a break from normal behavior that the official record does not explain. The debt to the creditor named in Percival Oates's letter, the debt that had pushed Reuben's plan into urgency, was, according to later county records, settled in February of 1838. The settlement was made at a big discount from the original amount, suggesting that the creditor, understanding the security for the debt no longer existed, took what he could get rather than nothing. Elias Tanner stayed at Harrow Hall for another 4 years, running the property with hired labor before selling it in 1841 to a man from Georgia who had no connection to the place's earlier history. The buyer never learned why the fields behind the main house felt different from other fields. He never learned why the cabin row had that particular quality of a space that had been lived in and then left, rather than just abandoned. He never asked. He had bought land and a house, and that's what he had. Elias Tanner moved to Columbia after the sale. He died there in 1853. His death notice in the Columbia paper described him as a former planter of Lancaster District, known as a man of industry and sound character. It did not mention a wife. Eleanora had died in 1847, in circumstances the records describe only as an illness of the lungs, brief and severe, and no children. It did not mention any unusual circumstances of his later years. It did not mention October 1837. It did not mention 43 people at all. When Oliver Hatch found Adeline Spratt in a house on the edge of Columbia in the autumn of 1875, she was 73 years old and had been waiting, in a sense, for someone like him to show up for a long time. She had the 11 letters from Eleanora Tanner. She had the oral history of her grandmother, Grace, kept with the care of someone who understands that oral history, when written records fail or are destroyed, is the only archive left. She had her own memories. She had been a child during the years of her grandmother's letters with Eleanora, and she had heard things the way children who were thought too young to understand still hear and remember. She had carried all of this for 38 years, through the war and what came after, through Reconstruction and its failures, through every change that had swept across the South in the decades since that October night. And she had never spoken of it publicly because there had never been anyone to speak to who would understand. Hatch spent 3 days with her. He took detailed notes. He was, by his own account in the introduction to the manuscript he eventually produced, a manuscript that was not published in his lifetime and that survives in a single copy in a private archive in Pennsylvania, shaken by the experience in a way his years of journalism had not prepared him for. "I had gone looking for a mystery," he wrote. "I found instead a record of human determination so thorough and so carefully made that I was ashamed to have called it mysterious. The mystery had always been in the absence of the record, not in the events themselves. The events were comprehensible enough. It was the silence that had been imposed on them for 38 years that needed explaining. And that explanation, when it came, was the most ordinary and most terrible of things. The silence had been maintained because the truth was inconvenient for the people with the power to decide what was documented and what was not. He spent the next 17 years trying to fill in the record. He found more contact keepers. He found church records in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He found the Quaker meeting document that mentioned August. He found in an archive in Greensboro, North Carolina, a single line in an old account book belonging to a man named Calvin Hester. A man who the surrounding entries suggest had some connection to the assistance network that ran through the Carolina and Virginia back country in the 1830s. It read, October 17, 1837. Party of 27 arrived. All well. Movement continued north. 27 souls. 3 days after leaving Harrow Hall. Still together. Still moving. The manuscript Hatch produced runs to several hundred pages. It was never published. After his death, it passed through several hands before ending up in a private archive in Philadelphia, where it stayed mostly untouched until a historian working on a broader study of antebellum escape networks in the 1920s came across it and wrote a short account of its contents. That account was published in a small academic journal and got little attention at the time. The Harrow Hall story did not enter the broader historical record in any meaningful way until the mid-20th century, when the growing field of African American history began the systematic work of recovering exactly the kind of story that had been deliberately and carefully buried. By then, the people it was about had been gone for 100 years. There is a way in which the usual telling of escape stories, the way they have most often been told when they have been told at all, focuses on the danger, the pursuit, the close calls, the dramatic turns of fortune. Those elements are real, and they matter. But they can, if they become the only frame, hide something else about what happened at Harrow Hall. The extraordinary degree to which what happened there was not a dramatic breaking free, but a deliberate, organized, collectively willed act of the plainest kind. Reuben did not escape. He planned. He spent 4 years in patient, methodical preparation, carrying knowledge he had gotten from a carpenter in 1833, and slowly turning it into a structure capable of carrying 43 people through 11 days of travel to a place none of them had ever seen, but all of them believed in. Delia did not flee. She observed. She read the letter in the study drawer, and she understood it, and she waited for the right moment to share what she knew. And she managed her own fear with such discipline that the men whose household she worked in, and the overseer whose rounds she had memorized, and the whole institutional machinery of a system of social control, none of them detected it. August did not run. He listened. He learned to read in the stolen pieces of a year when he was 12. And he used that reading, 20 years later, to take in information that 11 minutes of talk at a camp meeting could not fully convey, and to pass it on to the people who needed it. The silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of purpose. It was what happens when a community that has been told by every means available to the society around it that it has no agency, no future, no choices, no will that matters, shows in a single night that it has been planning otherwise. That is the silence Hiram Cook felt when he drove his wagon up the lane on the morning of October 15th, and the air pressed in around him in a way he couldn't name. He was standing in the aftermath of something the world he lived in had been designed to make impossible. And the impossibility of it, the sheer, quiet, devastating fact of it, was what made the place feel to a plain man not given to fancy like somewhere holding its breath. The breath had already been let out. The people were already miles away. The men from Georgia, who bought Harrow Hall in 1841, planted the fields and worked them for a decade and sold the property in 1852 to a family who used it for timber. By the time of the Civil War, the cotton gin had been taken apart and the barn had partly fallen in. The main house was lived in by a family who had no connection to the Tanners and no knowledge of what had happened there 25 years before. The cabin row, those structures behind the main house where Reuben and Delia and August and 40 others had lived and planned and prepared, slowly got taken back by the vegetation the Carolina back country is always trying to reclaim from human use. By the end of the century, the structures were gone. The clearing stayed for a while, and then it too was overgrown. By the time the first real historical searches began in the mid-20th century, there was no physical trace of the cabins that could be clearly identified. The main house stood until 1879, when it was damaged in a storm and the owner at the time chose not to fix it. It was torn down the next year. The site passed through several more owners in the decades after, each one knowing less than the last about what had happened there, until by the early 20th century, it was just a piece of land in the Carolina back country. Flat, heavy. The kind of ground that seemed to soak up light instead of reflecting it. Where the tree line pressed close, and the sky above the clearings was always somehow smaller than you expected. Well near the yard, which had been the practical center of the property's daily life for decades, lasted longest. It showed up on a property survey in 1903, described simply as an old well, dry. It was filled in some time after that. Oliver Hatch's manuscript, the most complete account of the Harrow Hall story ever put together, stayed in a private archive in Philadelphia until the 1960s, when it was given to a university library. It is available to researchers. It has been cited in a handful of academic works. It has never been the subject of a popular history, a newspaper feature, or a commemorative marker. The people it records never got formal recognition from any institution. There is no plaque at Barracks Crossing, which is now anyway a place that exists only on old surveying charts, to mark the night of October 14, 1837. There is no marker on the land that was once Harrow Hall. There is no official record that acknowledges what was planned there, what was risked there, what was done there. The silence was very thorough. It did its work for a very long time. But silences, even thorough ones, have a way of developing small cracks. A letter survives in a box. An old man in Ohio remembers what Hiram Cook said when he walked the cabin row. A journalist finds a woman in Colombia who has been waiting 38 years for someone to come and ask the right questions. A single line in an account book in a Greensboro archive. October 17, 1837. Party of 27 arrived. All well. The silence of Harrow Hall was not the silence of nothing. It was the silence of something that had been hidden. And the thing that had been hidden, when it was finally brought into the light, was not a mystery. It was not inexplicable. It was not a ghost story or a tale of the supernatural or an unsolved crime that baffled investigators for generations. It was instead what 43 people decided to do with one October night when the moon was dark and the air was cool and every year of preparation came finally, precisely, to its moment. It was, when all was said and done, the most human thing imaginable. The hardest part of the story, and maybe the most important part, is this. The night itself was only the end of something. Not the beginning. The beginning was Reuben sitting on the step of his cabin on a Sunday evening in late July, listening to August tell him about a letter in a study drawer, and saying in a voice too low to carry, "Then we have until October." And deciding, quietly. In the spring of 1876, Oliver Hatch published a short piece in the Columbia paper. A shortened version of what he had learned from Adeline Spratt and his years of research. He left out the names that might put people still living at legal or social risk. He published it under a careful headline and didn't expect much response. Over the next 6 weeks, he got 23 letters. 11 of them were hostile. Men who told him, in language ranging from politely disapproving to openly threatening, that he had no business disturbing the settled history of the region. That his account was wrong. That he should stick to more suitable subjects. 2 of the hostile letters were unsigned. 12 of them were something else. They were from people who had heard, over the years, pieces of the story. A grandmother's memory. A line in an old letter. Something a neighbor once said and then didn't say again. They were from people who had always known, in the specific way communities know things they have decided collectively not to speak aloud, that something had happened in the back country in October of 1837 that the official record did not contain. One letter, and signed, written in a careful and unpracticed hand, contained only a single sentence. They made it, most of them. I know this because I am one of the ones who helped them along the way, and I have kept that knowledge in me for 39 years, and I am glad at last that someone has asked. Oliver Hatch never identified the person who wrote that letter. He said in his private papers that he had a strong suspicion, a suspicion so strong he was certain it was not just a suspicion at all, but that confirming it publicly would serve no purpose that justified the risk to the person who had written it. He kept the letter in the manuscript. It is still there. The manuscript is still in the university library. The letter is still unnamed. And Harrow Hall. The land that was once Harrow Hall. That flat, heavy ground where 34 years of Reuben's life had been spent. Where Delia had cleared breakfast dishes and read a man's face and filed what she saw in the archive behind her eyes. It is still out there somewhere in the Carolina back country. Taken back into the landscape. Holding whatever it holds in the silence it learned long ago to keep. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we've uncovered everything there is to know about the night of October 14, 1837? Or are there answers still buried in archives no one has yet thought to open? Leave your theory in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you question what gets written down and what gets quietly closed away, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us here for the stories that history tried to forget. We'll see you in the next one.